Bonjour tout le monde, j'espère que vous allez bien. So, why don't people get French verbs? You might be a bit disappointed or even nervous about my answer, but for me, the main culprit is grammar, or rather the lack of grammatical understanding. So why is grammar important? Well, let's imagine you want to cook a dish. You will have a recipe to follow and use some ingredients. But then if you just stop at the ingredients, you see that you cannot complete your recipe because you don't know what to do with the ingredients. Do you mix them? How long do you cook them for? That's something you need to find out. And you find out from the method. And in language, the method is grammar. In other words, your ingredients are the words of language and the method is grammar. The grammar will tell you how words interact with one another and what you need to do with the words to form or to create your recipe, which is language. And that's all it is. It gives clarity. Once you know the grammatical terms, it saves an awful lot of time. But of course, you need to understand the grammar in your own language. And this is where I'm getting a little bit annoyed. Because in education, far too often, grammar is considered as a science or some skill that is reserved to an elite of people. When in fact, everybody can learn grammar. And in fact, grammar is your right. You have the right to understand the grammar of your own language. And if you know the grammar of your own language, learning another language is going to be a lot easier. And I think far too often that's denied from people. So enough ranting, because I could go on all day. Let's have a look at what we are going to do in this lesson. I have planned this video so that you understand some grammatical terms, and I will go back to basics. Also important is for you to understand processes. And finally, I will give you some learning tips. Now, what this video is not is a video about learning different French tenses. That's not what it is. The aim of this lesson is for you to know how to use French verbs as a whole. But for now, c'est parti! Since we're talking about verbs today, the first question we should ask ourselves is what is actually a verb? Now, if you already know the answer, that's brilliant, but if you don't, let's be 100% clear about what it is. A verb is the word used to define either a physical action, to eat, to run, for example, he ate an apple. It can also define a mental action, to think, to guess, for example, I'm thinking of the past. Or it can define a state, to be, to seem, for example, she will be very happy. Verbs are essential in sentences because you cannot form a sentence without a verb. You cannot have a sentence without either an action or a state. The next key question is, what is a tense? A tense defines when the action takes place. So if I take this example, he ate an apple, I know it's the past because I've got ate. If now I say he is eating an apple, I know it's the present because I have is eating. And if I say he will eat an apple, I know it's the future because I've got will eat. So a tense is the way the verb looks like that tells us when the action takes place. Now let's have a look at a specific tense, the present tense. The present tense refers, of course, to the present moment. If I look at these two sentences, he eats an apple, he is eating an apple. What is the difference? Well, in the first sentence, he eats an apple, we're referring to a fact or a habit. I could have said, he eats an apple every day. This tense is called the simple present. Now, what about the other example? He is eating an apple. When I say that, I'm implying that the action is happening now, as I speak. This tense is called the present continuous. Now, it's important to bear that in mind because this tense has got an implication for the use of verbs in French. So let's have a look at what it is. When using verbs in the present tense, you have to remember that in French, the present continuous does not exist. Now, it's key to understand that because it will prevent you from making some common errors, like, for example, translating word for word this sentence, he is eating. Now, I've seen that done so many times where people try to translate il, est, and then something else. It's simply impossible in French. We cannot translate the present continuous literally. So, if the present continuous is not an option in French, what happens if we want to translate what's happening now as we speak? Well, in French, we only use the simple present. So, saying he eats an apple is the same in French as saying he's eating an apple. We use the simple present in both cases. Now you're about to learn a key grammatical term that is essential if you want to know how to use verbs in French. So let's have a look at these sentences. He eats an apple, I eat an apple, we ate an apple, my sister will eat an apple, you are eating an apple, the horse has eaten an apple. If I look at all these sentences, I know who is doing the action because I've got he, I, we, my sister, and of course I've got he eats with an S at the end, so that's the sign of he, etc. The other thing I know when the action takes place because we have different tenses. Eats, are eating, will eat, has eaten. So all these verbs tell us who's doing the action when the action takes place. What they have in common, however, is they all refer to the same action, done by different people at different time, but we only referring to one action, and it's the action of eating. To eat. To eat is the verb in its raw basic form. It only tells us what the action is about. It's the type of verb that you will find in a dictionary. And this verb, and I want you to remember that, is called the infinitive verb. It's the raw basic form of the verb. In French, the infinitive form is shown by the ending of the verb. What it means is if I take this infinitive English verb to eat, where I've got the little preposition to, in French, we're going to end up with manger, with the last two letters showing that it's the infinitive. So in English, you have two words, the to plus the verb, and in French, we only have one word with a specific ending. There are three types of verbs in French. We have the verbs with an infinitive ending in ia, like we've just seen, manger. We have verbs with an infinitive ending in ir, for example, to finish, finir. And finally, we have verbs with an infinitive ending in re, for example, to sell, vendre. Let's check what we've learned so far. In a sentence, the verb is the word defining the action or the state. The tense is the form of the verb that shows when the action takes place. An infinitive is the basic form of the verb, the form you would find in a dictionary, for example. And then finally, the to of English infinitives is shown as endings in French infinitives, and these endings are er, ir, or are. Another important term is the term conjugating. So what does it mean to conjugate a verb? If I take the infinitive verb, the verb in its raw form, for example, to eat, to conjugate that verb means to change it so that I know who is doing the action and when the action takes place using different tenses. So if I take my sentences from earlier, I see that I know who's doing the action because I've got he, I, we, my sister, you, the horse. And I also know when the action takes place because I've got eat, ate, will eat, has eaten. These are different tenses. So in fact, all these verbs are conjugated. So now let's see how it's done in French. Now that we know what it means to conjugate a verb, let's do it in French, and we're going to do it in the present tense of ER verbs. First, we need to know what the action is. We're going to need an infinitive, and the one I've chosen is danser, to dance. Danser ends in ER, it's an ER verb. The second thing we need to work out is who is doing the action, and for that we need what we call subject pronouns. Let's have a look at them in a bit more detail. So what is a subject pronoun? First of all, in a sentence, the subject is whoever or whatever does the action of the verb. If I say my brother eats an apple, we have the action eats. Who's doing it? My brother. My brother is the subject in the sentence. The next step, the function of a pronoun is to replace something, usually a noun. Therefore, a subject pronoun will replace the subject. Now, if I say my brother eats an apple, if I want to replace the subject, my brother, by a pronoun, I'm going to say he. He eats an apple. He is the subject pronoun. So let's see how they are pronounced in French. Je, tu, il, elle, on, nous, vous, il, elle. There are a couple of things that you need to know about subject pronouns, and although overall they are more or less the same in English and French, there are a couple of differences that you need to be aware of. So first of all, we need to bear in mind that there are two categories of pronouns. We have the singular pronouns, where we're referring to one person only, and then there are the plural pronouns, where we're referring to more than one person. If I take I, myself, as the starting point, then I'm going to be the first person. If now I speak to somebody else, that person is going to be the second person. Now, if I think of other people, they're going to be either he or she, and they're going to be the third person. So we've got the first person singular, second person singular, third person singular. Now, for plural pronouns, if I take myself as a starting point, this time I'm included in a group of at least another person. I'm not going to say I, I'm going to say we, and that's going to be the first person plural. Now, the next one, vous, can mean two things. If I speak to someone else, one person only, but I'm showing respect because I don't know them very well, or because they're older than me, could be my boss, someone like that, I'm going to use a polite form, a formal form, to say you, as opposed to tu, second person singular, which is the familiar form, the form that you will use with a friend or a member of your family. So we can use tu and vous for one person, but of course vous can be used for several people, second person plural. Finally, if I'm thinking of other people and I'm thinking of a group of people and the elements are masculine elements, and I mean masculine in the grammatical sense, then I'm going to use il. If a feminine element is added to this group, it still remains il. However, if the group I'm thinking about is only made up of feminine elements, I'm going to use elle. And these are the third person plural. In French, there is no subject pronoun for it. Therefore, if the subject is not a person, it can be an object, an idea, a concept, we still have to decide which pronoun we are going to replace it with. Now, in French, all nouns are either masculine or feminine. Therefore, if I take things like un stylo, le pain, which are masculine words, I'm going to use il because there's only one, so it's singular. Same with feminine. If I take feminine words, une maison, la table, I can replace these words with elle. If there's more than one, then they still remain either masculine and feminine. Therefore, trois stylos, 3 pens, is going to be il. And then if I'm talking about the tables in the plural, is going to be elle. Now let's go back to conjugating our ER verb in the present tense. Now we know about subject pronouns that are going to allow us to know who is doing the action. The last bit we need to do is to show that it's the present tense, show when the action takes place. So if I add the infinitive, you can see straight away it doesn't make sense because je dansais would mean I to dance. So we need to get rid of the mark of the infinitive. When I do that, I am left with a part of the verb that is called the stem. The stem is the part of the verb that is left once I've removed the ER of the infinitive. And now, the only thing I have to do is to add the endings for the present tense. And they go like this. Je danse, tu danses, il danse, elle danse, on danse, nous dansons, vous dansez, il danse, elle danse. Now let's do the same for IR verbs. First of all, what is the action? This time I've chosen the verb finir, to finish. Second thing is who's doing the action. We have our subject pronouns. Then, show is the present tense. We add the infinitive, get rid of the ending, we end up with the stem, and then we add the endings for IR verbs, which are je finis, tu finis, il finit, elle finit, on finit, nous finissons, vous finissez, ils finissent, elles finissent. Now let's conjugate the last type of verbs, the RE verbs. We take the infinitive. Here I've chosen vendre, ending in RE. We know about subject pronouns. We need to show it's the present tense, so we cannot leave the infinitive as it is. We get rid of the ending. We're left with the stem, and then we add the endings for RE verbs in the present tense. So we have je vends, tu vends, il vend, elle vend, on vend. Note that for these three, there's nothing added. Nous vendons, vous vendez, ils vendent, elles vendent. If you feel a bit overwhelmed with all these different endings, that's perfectly normal. But there is some good news. Because if you look at the phonetic transcription in brackets, you notice that there are some patterns. So when you speak the language, that should really help you. For example, if you look at all the verbs which are conjugated with singular pronouns, these, you notice that they all pronounce the same. So if I look at ER verbs, for example, I have je danse, tu danses, il danse, elle danse, on danse. And if I carry on with ER verbs, I notice that the third person plural is also pronounced the same. Il danse, elle danse. The ENT at the end of a verb is silent. So that's why we've got il danse, he dances, with a silent E at the end, and ils dansent, they dance, sounding exactly the same because the ENT is also silent. Then for IR verbs, again the third person plural sound the same, and the same for RE verbs. For RE verbs, note that the consonant before the ending is actually pronounced. So we're not going to say vent, we're going to say vende. And then last little tip, when you see nous, usually you should expect to hear the sound on. If you see vous, you should usually expect to hear the sound et. So this is a little summary with the endings the way they should look like and the endings the way they should sound like for each of the type of verbs. Now let's put that into practice. Before we move on to the practice, I just want to do a little recap. First, we must remember that there is no present continuous in French, and therefore we cannot say I am doing. We must always say I do and use the simple present. The second thing, to conjugate a verb means changing it so that we know who's doing the action, but especially when the action takes place. To conjugate a verb in the present tense in French, we must take the infinitive verb, remove its ending, either ER, IR or RE, and add the appropriate endings using the subject pronouns. Finally, we need to look for patterns. Let's put what we've learned into practice. If I try to translate this short phrase, first of all, I need to know what the action is in French, therefore I'm going to look it up in a dictionary or online. So I need to find the infinitive verb to watch and find out what it is in French. And in French it is regarder. It's an ER verb. Once I know that, I know I need to conjugate my verb with I. I is je. Therefore, I'm going to have a look at ER verbs, and the ending with je is an E, and it's silent. So I'm going to end up with je regarde, and the pronunciation is regarde with the silent E. Let's take a second example, and this time we want to translate my sister is waiting. Now, this is the present continuous, is waiting. We cannot translate it word for word in French. Instead, we're going to use the simple present. Then we need to find out how to say to wait in French. So we will look it up, and we find out that in French it's the verb attendre, an RE verb. The next step, we need to translate our subject, my sister. If you didn't know, the way to say my sister is ma sœur. Now I need to know what I can replace ma sœur with, which pronoun. Ma sœur is she, elle. Therefore, the correct ending for Ari verb is going to be nothing, because we don't add anything in the third person singular for Ari verbs. Therefore, we're going to end up with Ma sœur attend, and it's pronounced attend. Last example, the trees are blossoming. Again, we see that we've got a present continuous sentence. We cannot translate it like that. We need to use the simple present. We find out how to say to blossom in French, and it's fleurir. This time we've got an IR verb. The next step is to find out how to say the trees, the subject, and the way we say that in French is les arbres. Les arbres can be replaced by il because it means they. Therefore, let's have a look at the endings for IR verbs with they, and it's is. Therefore, the trees are blossoming. Les arbres fleurissent, pronounced fleurissent, and it means both the trees blossom and the trees are blossoming. There's one question I hear quite often, and it's this one: what are irregular verbs? Well, the answer is in the question. They are irregular. They do not follow the regular pattern that normal verbs follow. They have, in fact, their own pattern. Now, these verbs, unfortunately, are very common in language, but that's the bad news, because the good news is because they are so common, you will learn them very quickly. There are, however, two verbs that you should absolutely know. These two verbs are key verbs, and you'll see why later on in the video. Their infinitives are être, to be, and avoir, to have. And if you look at the way they're conjugated, you see that they are irregular because they do not follow the usual pattern for RE verbs and IR verbs. Now let's try to pronounce them correctly. The verb être first. Je suis, tu es, il est, elle est, on est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils sont, elles sont. Then avoir, j'ai, tu as, il a, elle a, on a, nous avons, vous avez, ils ont, elles ont. To be clear about tenses in French as a whole, there's one more thing you should know. In this video, we've been focusing on the present tense so that we could understand how to conjugate verbs. Now let me reveal that the present tense is part of what we call simple tenses. If I take an example of a sentence in the present tense, I have the subject, the stem, and the ending. All the simple tenses that you will come across will follow the same process: subject, stem, ending. I'll give you some examples. So we already know about the present tense, but you also have the simple past, the subjunctive, the simple future, the conditional, the imperfect. And in fact, now that you know that they are simple tenses, the only question you need to ask yourself when using one of these tenses is, first of all, when is the action taking place with this particular tense? How do I get to the stem? Because there will be different ways to get to the stem. It might not be the same stem as the present tense. And then finally, which are the 6 endings? By that I mean the endings for the first, second, third person singular, and the endings for the first, second, and third person plural. Once you've understood that, you realize that it's not more difficult to use the present tense than it is to use the conditional, the imperfect, or the subjunctive. It's the same principle because they are simple tenses. Now, if there are simple tenses, it must mean that there are others. And of course, there are. There's another category of tenses called the compound tenses. So let's have a look at them. We have two sentences here. I am confident, we have a big house. If I say I am confident, I've got am that comes from the infinitive to be, and it describes the state I'm in. If we say we have a big house, it comes from the infinitive to have, and have here means we own a big house. They have a meaning. If now I change the sentences into this, I am watching TV, we have finished the cake. If I say I am watching TV, I'm not describing my state. If I say we have finished the cake, we're not saying what we own. Have doesn't have that meaning anymore. In fact, those two verbs are now used to form another tense. And when that's the case, when to be and to have are used to form another tense, they are called auxiliary verbs. To be and to have conjugated to form another tense are called auxiliary verbs. Then we have another part which we are going to call the participle, because it's the part of the verb that participates in forming another tense. So that's what a compound tense is. A compound tense comprises an auxiliary verb, which is going to be always either to be or to have, and a past participle. And compound tenses work exactly the same in French. So we know that in French we have simple tenses and compound tenses. If I give you an example, we have finished in French is nous avons fini. We have a subject, an auxiliary verb, either être or avoir. That's why I said it was important to learn those two verbs. And then a participle, which in French are going to be past participles with various endings. You can look at that a bit later. As I said, this video is not about learning the tenses individually, but to learn about the tenses. So compound tenses, we have a few. When you have the perfect, the pluperfect, the future perfect, the conditional perfect, they're all going to work according to that pattern, to that process. Subject, auxiliary verb, participle. So every time you come across one of these tenses, ask yourself the question, when is the action taking place? When I use this tense? And then, is it être ou avoir that I need to use as an auxiliary? And what tense is the auxiliary? And then finally, what is the past participle ending? So there is a slightly different process with compound tenses, but overall, this is how all French tenses work. As a little bonus, I wanted to give you a list of verbs that you might find useful. I'm going to give you these verbs conjugated in the first person singular, and you'll see why they're so easy to use. So the first type is what we call modal verbs. Je veux, je voudrais, je peux, je dois. The second type is opinion verbs. J'aime, j'adore, je déteste, je préfère. And the last verb is je vais, I'm going, which is used to form what we call the immediate future. Why are they so easy to use? Because all you have to do with them is to add an infinitive. So here are three infinitives. If I want to form sentences with these, I can say, for example, je voudrais manger, I would like to eat. J'aime finir, I like to finish. Je vais vendre, I'm going to sell. Tip number 1, practice little and often. It's better to practice 5 minutes every day than 3 hours on a Saturday. That doesn't work. In fact, our brains are not designed to memorize things like that. So little and often. Memorize the 6 endings. I said 6 endings because for the third person, whether it's singular or plural, the endings are the same. So in fact, there are only 6 verb endings in any tense that you can come across that you'll ever have to remember. So try to say these out loud and repeat until you do not hesitate anymore and you know these endings off by heart. Also useful is to chant the conjugated verb because it helps with the pronunciation. So, for example, je danse, tu danses, il danse, elle danse, nous dansons, etc. Then, once you're happy with one verb, do the same with another of the same category. For example, je regarde, tu regardes, il regarde, etc. Each time insisting on the pronunciation. Chanting the verb endings or the verb themselves are very good strategies to memorize verb endings, but this one is really encouraging you to think of the verb ending. It's a very simple principle. You just write down the pronouns on pieces of paper, look up a verb in a dictionary or online, and simply pick a pronoun, a piece of paper with a pronoun, and conjugate the verb as quickly as you can. This is a very useful technique to establish a routine. All you have to do is to take some sticky notes, write the pronouns, the subject pronouns on individual sticky notes, stick those notes around your house. Then in the morning, pick a verb, check how it's conjugated first because it could be an irregular verb, in which case you need to know how it should be written. Then once you know that, during the day, every time you come across one of the sticky notes, you simply need to conjugate that verb according to the subject pronoun that you see. And that really is it. But what it does, it encourages you to think on your feet almost. And then it helps you really get in to memorize verbs much quicker. It might sound like a cliche and you must think, well, she's only saying that because it sounds good at the end of a video. But no, I'm a true believer of patience and kindness to yourself because stress is not conducive to learning. So if you're struggling with your verbs and you're getting frustrated, leave them for a bit and come back to them later. Seriously, be patient. It's going to take time. For some people, it will take less time than others. It doesn't matter. You will get there. That's the main thing. So that's it for today. If you want more videos with a step-by-step approach to grammar, please subscribe to my channel. The other thing I want you to bear in mind is that I use phonics to help with pronunciations in my videos. So if you are interested, you can download the handout from my website. It's totally free. And you can also watch the video on the subject. But other than that, all I have to say now is au revoir et à bientôt.